around what happened involving farmers in Senekal in the Free State. You'll remember, of course, their violent protests that saw them attacking police vehicles and storming the holding cells after the murder of the farm foreman Brendan Horner. Well, Professor Somadoda Fikeni joins us now. Professor, I put it to you that, in a way, this had many of South Africa's dynamics around race, around power, around violence, around policing, and also about what's happening in rural communities and how black people are often treated by white people.
Indeed, to start with, we do have a history of racial divisions, and the debate around the land issue, around the treatment of farm workers, has complicated that particular matter. But also we do have just a general problem of law enforcement, in which case the state is looking weaker and weaker in face of protests, some of them violent. And also the fact that there tend to be more responses whenever something is destroyed or there is burning than when you are making a formal, request for a meeting. And in this particular case, I do think that it's going to ignite racial tensions and put a spotlight on the issue of farm matters, but also on the issue of the treatment of farm workers, as well as the crime in general, as to whether there is consistency in the treatment of crime.
We talk about race often in this country. I mean, there are big conversations around, some people claim we talk about it too much. Many people, I think, believe we don't talk about it enough. But it's also quite an urban conversation. It would appear we need to have spend a lot more time talking about what's happening in our rural areas, our small towns, our farms.
There is no doubt that much of the focus and the clout in the media coverage and in the state responses tend to be in the big metros. And that is not the sum total of South African experience. Hence, the issue of the farm matters, as well as the treatment of farm workers and the rural development issue, is coming thick and fast, and people are feeling frustrated and often neglected in the main, because it looks like only in the big cities things do happen. They get coverage, and sometimes you do have these dramatic scenes, and only then that you see the focus, which is usually in the big cities, coming to those areas.
We've seen, in some cases, it seems that some of the people involved in these farming communities, they don't necessarily seem to accept the authority of the state. And this really takes us back to how the state changed in 1994. Is that a component of this in some way, do you think?
There is a component of alienation, generally, and a sense of trying to be self-sufficient in terms of security, which has its own limits, as you see the matters in the farms continuing. And that in itself, I do think that it is now boiling to the surface, and this may also be compounded by sheer desperation and poverty, as well as the loss of revenue for those in business during and in the post-COVID period.
In other words, like almost everyone everywhere, in every situation, if you're feeling poorer, people get more desperate and they get angrier.
Certainly, they would like to look for something to project their anger on, and the compounded state failures in terms of bailing out some of the struggling businesses in these small towns. And the fact that some of these small towns basically have become so weak economically as people leave for the bigger cities, and the farmers themselves, some of them are struggling, and the farm workers is the same problem. At the same time, the agitation for redistribution of land has heightened these particular tensions. And if it is not contained and there is no clear leadership to manage this situation, only the extreme political forces will benefit, because they tend to have a clearer articulation of anger, of bitterness, rather than the mainstream politics.
So we have huge tensions in these areas, and obviously it's informed by our past and our present. What would it take to heal this anger, to to try and sort of find a way to actually get people to talk to each other, to try and change the dynamic?
Well, I do think that the first one is the law enforcement, where the law takes its own course on those who might have banned the police van. But at the same time, that should not just be the end of it. Effort to bring these communities together and discuss the future security of rural communities and discuss the whole range of other issues which are linked to these particular problems, including the distress in those communities. If there is a grand plan for such, it may go a long way to deal with the challenges. Law enforcement alone will not contain farm matters, will not contain general crime levels in the country. You do need to build a sense of social cohesion by dealing with two things which look contradictory at face value, but which must be done. The first one, deal with the legacy of the past, but at the same time, work towards uniting the country.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed.